Everyone, and welcome to this month's webinar in which we're going to be discussing redundancy and specifically looking at prevention, the process, and also key steps for ensuring a smooth transition, both for employees and the business. But before we get going, we'd like to introduce ourselves. I'm Victoria Templeton, the HR Knowledge Manager here at HR Solutions, and I'm joined today by Sue Watson. Sue is our Operations Director, and together we're going to be guiding you through today's topic. We've got so many of you here today, which is great to see. We've placed you all on mute. However, as usual, we do like to get your involvement in the webinar. And we'll do that by, first of all, inviting you to ask us questions. So we're going to aim to answer as many as we can at the end and go through your live questions and hopefully you can get through them all. And on the screen now, you'll see the image of what your GoToWebinar question panel looks like. So simply type in your question, and then we'll aim, as I said, to read out and answer as many as we can at the end. And another way of engaging with you through the session is to operate our polls. So polls not only help to steer the webinar, but it also enables us to share how the topic is being managed in our own workplaces and can therefore actually help share ideas with everyone of best practice and what other organisations are doing. So when you see this slide, we are going to be running a poll. They are confidential. We only publish the results from the question that we pose. So in terms of the agenda, because redundancy is a complex process and probably one of the most challenging business activities, given the impact it has on both individuals and their families as well as employers, there's quite a lot of legal complexity to it. And so we are limited with time, but this webinar is really about drawing your attention to some of the main key elements of what makes a potentially fair and legal compliant redundancy. So we're going to first of all look at how you can prevent the redundancy, and then I'm going to take you through the key elements or some of the key elements of what would make a potentially fair dismissal on those grounds. And then we're going to be looking also at how you can ensure that smooth business transfer. So whilst we hope that by taking proactive preventative steps you can prevent the need for redundancies, unfortunately it doesn't always work. So we will share you know, our advice and guidance on how you can ensure that smooth business transfer. And then as usual we'll follow up with our Q&A session at the end. And we'll begin with just some introductory questions, and this is really just for getting to know everybody. So what type of organisation you're working in, who supports you with your human resource management, and the sector that you operate in. So we'll quickly run some polls and see where everybody, what kind of organisation you all work in. As I said, this is all confidential, so it's just really to help in the running of the session.
Okay, we'll just leave that a couple more seconds.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll close and share that one.
Yep.
So we have, oh, we've got a majority in the slightly larger end today.
Okay.
Which is interesting. Most people in the medium to large sector. So it's interesting how each webinar attracts a different balance of size of business, isn't it? So shall we move on to the next one and then see where we are with who actually looks after HR in your business, which also might be slightly different on this one.
It is interesting getting to know, because you know what is very much reasonable in one organisation may not be reasonable in another, and a lot of that is to do with the context that you operate in, the size of your business, your resources and infrastructure. So it's helpful just to see the breakdown.
So I'll close and share that one. So as expected, we've got more in-house people on this call. So welcome to you all, fellow people struggling through all this mire of change that we're about to go into. And so therefore, the last one is around, in this section, is around the sector. just to give us an indication, because that also has an impact on processes, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So what do we have?
Let's close and share that one. So we have predominantly private sector, but we definitely have some private with public contracts and charity. So a good spread of those as well. So yes, thank you for that.
And again, the sector very much does drive your redundancy policies. You know, so if you perhaps a public sector, there may be more different terms to obviously if you operate in the private sector. So thank you for that. So I'll move the slides on. And the first piece is around just looking at how we can take proactive risk prevention steps so you don't have to resort to redundancies, which may help or may at least help in delaying the inevitable. But I just thought it's worthwhile just sharing, you know, some of the things to consider. So really, having a proactive risk prevention strategy is really important. It's an important business tool, and one of the areas is strategic workforce planning, and that's important for many reasons, but particularly as a way for preventing the need for redundancies. So if we think about strategic workforce planning, it allows you to forecast your future needs in terms of skills, roles, number of employees. And so that can help you in making your recruitment more targeted. And by anticipating your future needs, you will hopefully avoid those sudden surges in hiring, creating situations where you have excess employees in certain areas, which essentially could all lead to ultimately making redundancies further down the line. You could also consider, you know, the workforce planning to help you look at upskilling and reskilling your existing workforce to fill those future gaps rather than recruiting. So this maximizes the potential of your current employees and reduces the need for external recruitment, and allows you to develop your skill base from within. So it's thinking ahead about the future and what skill sets you're going to require. And actually upskilling and developing your own workforce is actually a significant contributor to positive employee engagement, and it can be a good retention tool. So actually there's lots of benefits for that. In terms of cost management and efficiency, there are many ways that you can take measures to prevent having to take redundancies. And, you know, some of the common ones are putting a freeze on recruitment, allowing for natural attrition, so you're not replacing a role when somebody leaves. It may be restricting things like your overtime, reducing or eliminating non-essential spending. So there's quite a lot of financial measures that you can introduce, or even things like offering unpaid leave and sabbaticals. So that's just another aspect that you can consider for hopefully preventing the need for redundancies. And I've added on here about communication and employee involvement, and it's actually something that can be positive so long as there is care in how you handle the sharing of information. So being open and transparent in your communications about the business performance and any challenges without causing unnecessary alarm could actually foster that culture of the feeling of pulling together and everybody wanting to succeed. So exploring options and seeking employee ideas where appropriate on how to do business differently or how you can change processes. It allows you to take your employees with you on any change transition that may end up happening, and let your people feel that they are contributing to the direction of the business. But as I say, it does take extreme care in handling it and positioning your key messages in the right way so you're not causing that unnecessary harm. But it's certainly something to think about, and it's probably something that may be more suitable for those smaller organisations, but it's definitely something to think about. And clearly, if you are unionised, then be sure to engage early with your unions and try and foster that positive working relationship. And then if you think about flexible working, well, we've heard a lot in the last couple of years about a 4-day week. So could that be something that could actually allow the business to continue if it means saving the business? Clearly with that, there's a lot of practical and legal considerations to think about, because you can't just simply move from a 5-day operation to 4 days. Particularly from an employment law point of view, there's a lot of considerations, but it is something that could be put on the table and explored. You may also want to consider job sharing opportunities within your workforce, encourage more of that part-time working, or as I said a moment ago, things like unpaid leave and sabbaticals and career breaks and things like that. And then clearly there won't always be viable considerations, but thinking how your flexibility and how you operate and how you employ may support the ongoing running of your business. And finally, there's a couple of other mechanisms, and it's where the contract of employment allows, and that is in respect of the temporary layoffs, or if you were to offer the short-time working. But as I said, the contract of employment needs to allow you to do that, to be able to enforce it, because you can't just force somebody to not come into work. But even if you don't have it in your contract, you could try and agree and get somebody's consent to taking a period of a temporary layoff and short-time working. And we saw a lot of that during the pandemic, if you remember. And obviously for those clients and employers that did have it in the contract that allowed it, it was a much easier process to achieve. But if you don't, then just be mindful that you have to get the written consent and agreement from your employees to adopt those schemes. But they're definitely things to think about and consider. So I'm going to run a couple of polls now, and it's just really out of interest. What proactive risk prevention strategy either are you taking now if you are going through something, or would you consider in the future? And as I said, these polls are really helpful to everybody on the webinar, because it just gives you an insight as to how other organisations are thinking or what they're doing.
Okay, I'll close and share those
Yep.
results now. So there we go.
Yeah.
So
okay.
yeah, probably as expected,
isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want me to move on to the
Yep.
next one? Yep. So the next one is, are you actually contemplating any? Remember, this is completely confidential. It's just to understand the climate that we're in at the moment. Because we are getting lots of calls through our
We are, aren't we?
team about it. So
and I think
it's likely to be.
I think there is a lot of nervousness as well with the Employment Rights Bill, which we will touch on briefly at the end. You know, about the impact that will have on organisations and the ability to manage the cost implications of these reforms, etc.
Yeah.
So I
Exactly.
think it'll be an ongoing conversation and discussion, won't it, within organisations?
It's pretty close, actually, but it's a significant number either way.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
if over 50% of you are contemplating it in some shape or form, it's
difficult, isn't it?
It is
So
difficult
hopefully,
for them. Okay.
what we go through today, you'll hopefully find this beneficial, what we run through for you. Okay, so let's move the slide on. So I'm now going to share some advice and guidance on the elements of what goes towards making a potentially fair redundancy. And I think the one thing I'd say is we have a good idea through legislation, case law, ACAS codes as to what a process looks like, but there is a lot of determining what is reasonable when you deal with redundancies. So what I'll go on to explain now over the next few slides will essentially be the key obvious ones, but just be mindful that it all depends on the facts and circumstances. So, but before we get into the actual elements, I'm just going to briefly highlight the legal test that you have to meet when you're defending an unfair dismissal claim at tribunal on where there's been a dismissal because of redundancy. So, and I'll make it as straightforward as I can. So there's I guess a two-pronged approach. The first part is that as the employer, you must ensure that the redundancy situation was genuine. And the second hurdle that you've got to go over is to demonstrate that you acted reasonably in the way that you handled the process and the decision was a reasonable response to the situation. And I think the initial stage of this legal test is usually simpler. It's much more straightforward to be able to demonstrate a genuine redundancy situation based on the your business information and data, etc. It's the second stage that presents the greater challenge, because the term reasonable lacks any legal definition, and you'll be familiar with that anyway in other parts of employment law. So as the employer, you bear the responsibility of demonstrating with evidence that your actions were reasonable and fell within the range of acceptable responses when you carried out that redundancy dismissal. So like I said a moment ago, the elements I'm going to go through and share with you today go towards ensuring you achieve that fair redundancy dismissal. But do note that tribunal claims are very much fact specific, and it means what is reasonable in one situation may not be another. And if I think about one of the earlier polls in terms of how we're all split, we've got many of you who are operating a large organisation or medium, and then we've got a number of you working in micro and small businesses, and clearly it will be very different to how what reasonable looks like in your own organisation. We would always recommend you seek HR advice when managing business change programs, particularly from a very early stage and before any announcements made. That way, the circumstances relevant to your business and the job roles that are going to be impacted can be explored fully, and appropriate steps and advice can be carried out. So the following is an absolute minimum. And for those of you who have carried out redundancy processes, whilst the process may be straightforward, it's the decision making around how that process is applied that can be challenging. And I guess my final comment on it's about thinking about whether your decision in a redundancy situation to make somebody redundant, is that decision, would a reasonable employer also take that reasonable decision, which is probably easier said than to do. So what we're going to look through now in the next few slides are, first of all, how do you meet the legal definition? Avoiding redundancy, which we have to some extent already discussed in that earlier slide, but there's further discussion from a different perspective that I'll take you through. Hoping that everybody will know about the legal requirement to consult, but we'll cover something around the consultation piece, as well as ensuring fair selection. I'm also going to talk through how other available roles in the business is important to your process, and also flag a couple of approaches that could be adopted but aren't necessarily a legal requirement to do, namely voluntary redundancy and a procedure called known as bumping. And then I'll pick up on the actual dismissal piece itself and the process required for doing this fairly, and then cover off a piece about the statutory redundancy pay. So first of all, how do you meet the legal definition? Well, I suppose, like I said a moment ago, this is the first step in that two-stage legal test, and we have it written in legislation that tells us what qualifies as redundancy, as you can see on the slide here. So redundancy is one of the 5 potentially fair reasons for dismissal. It must fall within the legal definition. And, you know, redundancy includes business closures, workplace closures, reduction in the workforce. And as you'll see here, it's about whether you're ceasing or intending to cease to carry on the business for the purpose of which the employee was employed, ceasing or intending to cease to carry out that business in the place where the employee was so employed, having a reduced requirement for employees to carry out work of a particular kind, or to do so at the place where the employee was employed to work. Bit of a mouthful, but essentially it gives us the clear definition of what qualifies as a redundancy situation. And this is why your business planning is so important, and pulling together your business justification up front, because you need to be able to demonstrate, as I said, for the first test tribunal, that it was a redundancy situation. So we now need to also consider how you avoid redundancy, which I've to some extent explored through those very early measures that can be put in, like freezing recruitment, restricting overtime. But there's also other examples. So when you are dealing with potentially dismissing somebody, a tribunal expects a reasonable employer to take proactive steps in avoiding a redundancy situation. So when you are navigating that redundancy process with your employees, there are certain things that you should be doing to be reasonable in exploring how it can be avoided. And it can include things like, exploring flexible working options. Can job share arrangements be introduced as a way of trying to address the business challenges and still enable you to employ somebody? Could you allow for part-time working? Or redeployment is the main one that comes up, and we'll cover that as a separate piece shortly. And also retraining somebody. And then another really important thing to mention is to actually invite your employees to submit alternative proposals to address the business challenges. The business challenges are what's put them in that situation. And so if they have ideas that you perhaps may not have thought of, that could perhaps be a way round of, instead of making redundancies, then a reasonable employer should explore and consider that. Most of you, I'm sure, will know of the legal requirement to consult. We've got that again in legislation. We also have case rulings that help us determine how we manage it. But consultation is critical. It's multifaceted. It's about having the need for an open and honest dialogue about why redundancies are being considered, the proposed process, how individuals might be affected, and it helps employees understand the situation and reduce feelings of being unfairly treated. It's also about giving employees clear and comprehensive information about the proposed redundancies, including the reasons, the number of affected roles, the selection process, timelines, and redundancy pay arrangements, because they need to understand the impact for them personally. It's also about genuinely considering and discussing ways to avoid or reduce the number of redundancies. Now, this is crucial. It's a crucial legal obligation, but it's an ethical one as well. And it's important to remember that both employees and their representatives may have valuable suggestions that haven't been considered, like I said a moment ago. It's also important for explaining and discussing the criteria that will be used to select employees for redundancy. So ensuring that there are fair, objective and non-discriminatory selection processes. And so it allows employees to understand how the criteria will be applied and to raise any concerns if they have any. Consultation is also a forum in which to discuss ways to lessen the negative effects of redundancy on those affected. It can include exploring opportunities for alternative employment, providing support for finding new job roles, time off for job searching, career advice, as well as discussing redundancy pay and benefits. And then importantly, it's to proactively encourage and listen to and consider feedback, concerns, or, as I've said, alternative proposals. Even if not all suggestions are adopted, the consultation process demonstrates that the employee's input is valued and that meaningful consultation has taken place. Any consultation, regardless of numbers, must be meaningful. And that's another phrase like reasonableness. There's no definition, but you've got to go in there with the intention that you're trying to avoid that redundancy from happening. It should never be a tick box exercise. Employers must enter into consultation with the aim of trying to avoid having to make redundancies, like I've just said. So when it comes to the format of consultation, we do have that legal framework. And for example, if you're proposing to make less than 20 roles redundant in a 90-day period, your legal obligation is to carry out meaningful consultation. So there's no specific timescales, and you're able to consult individually with that person. So all of the reasons I've just set out about why consultation is important, that will all help in you demonstrating you've carried out meaningful consultation, because it's a two-way process. It's enabling that individual to contribute, share ideas, challenge, raise concerns, and that's the, I guess, fundamental piece when you go into consultation. Is you've got to be thinking you need to be avoiding redundancy. How can you stop it? And it's having that proactive discussion with your employees. Where you're proposing to make between 20 and 99 roles redundant at one establishment, and I'm going to mention this later on, you need to consult for at least 30 days before the first dismissal. And equally, if you are looking to make 100 roles redundant at one establishment, then the consultation timescale increases to a minimum of 45 days. Do remember to keep track of the numbers of who's been made redundant in your organisation, because you have to look over a 90-day period, and this is where we've got case rulings as well to help guide us for what this 90-day period looks like, because you could inadvertently think, oh, I can do individual consultation because we've only got 4 people that we're putting at risk. But actually, if you look back, those 4 people are part of a larger group where you've previously made redundancies, then it's the trigger point for collective consultation, and look forward as well. So we would always advise you offer individual consultation meetings for employees to discuss personal circumstances with you if they wish, rather than just having the collective consultation forums on their own. So if you think of collective consultation forums, you've got elected employee reps or trade union reps, and they're speaking on behalf of their employees and feeding back. But actually, quite often people want the opportunity to, I don't know, there may be something really personal that's will be impacted for them by the change. And so offering people to come and speak to you one-on-one is really important as well. And that's just being reasonable, which is what, in the eyes of the tribunal, want to see is that you've been a reasonable employer. And then finally, you must complete a HR1 form where you're making 20+ redundancies. And that HR1 form is a document that gets sent to the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, otherwise known as BEIS, because you have to inform the government of redundancies that are taking place in your organisation, and there can be penalties where that doesn't happen. So just bear in mind that you need to be doing that piece of administration as well. So got a couple of polls, or no, just one poll at this section. It's just really about, if you are looking to carry out a redundancy programme in the near future, or you're doing it now, which category do you fall into? How are the results looking? So we've got 83%. Can you hear me, Sue?
Hello, sorry, had an issue with my sound. So the biggest one is the individual consultation. So we've got less than 20 at risk is 83%, and then 13% on the collective and 4% on the 100+. So so the biggest impact is the individual. So it's a good sign that there's smaller numbers perhaps, but across probably more businesses.
Yeah, and I think it's just going to be important to just think about this 90-day calculation piece, isn't it?
Absolutely.
With the employment law developments on the horizon, business challenges that still remain is just being mindful of this 90-day obligation. You don't want to fail to collectively consult when you should have.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So moving on to selection, and so where you have a pool of employees, it will be necessary to determine the selection criterion. That needs to be fair and non-discriminatory. You do have the flexibility to choose a criteria, so you can prioritise retaining valuable employees. And ideally, the criteria should be objective, relevant to the business needs, justifiable, measurable, and evidence-based, rather than relying heavily on subjective opinions. So things like skills, qualifications, performance data, from consistent and objective reviews, by the way, productivity, technical expertise, these are all things that make good examples of how you would assess somebody. And actually selection is probably the most contentious issue at tribunal, and quite often it's the dismissal cited as unfair because of the selection criteria was not fairly applied, as opposed to the actual criteria used itself. So it's not just about making sure you've got that fair criteria, but you've got to have that fair assessment process as well as to how you determine who is to be redundant if the proposal goes ahead. But you also need to be mindful that where there is just one employee, tribunals do like to examine the facts to see if that choice of one is actually reasonable, i.e. you haven't included other people from elsewhere in the business when actually you should have done. So just be mindful of that as well. And selection is such a crucial part of the redundancy process, because ultimately it's the way in which you determine who is to be made redundant. So we strongly recommend that you agree with representatives in advance on the selection criteria that you're using and the methods being used, and try and get that agreement from all parties that the approach you're taking is fair and reasonable. We also advise having a second person to moderate the assessor scores. So it can either be a member of the HR team, so if you've got your own HR team, or a senior manager in the business. And the purpose of this sense check is just to be satisfied that a consistent approach has taken place in the scoring process, and that any considerations that have been considered have been fair and reasonable. So it's really good to have a moderation step incorporated into your processes. So still in keeping with selection, another important aspect is to allow the employees the opportunity to argue their own scores and put forward any arguments for why they should be reassessed as part of the consultation process. But also to potentially know what others scored. Now, this may seem controversial, but there is case law that argues for and against the sharing of other people's scores. But on balance, it does appear that to do so would be reasonable, as long as it's anonymised, because that's really important for the transparency and the employee, I guess, in the acceptance of the decision that is then made, where they truly sit in that scoring mechanism. It's also advisable that what's known as a break point, so there will be a point at which an employee must score to avoid being selected for redundancy. So this is important to share what that is, and you would share what that point is as part of your consultation process, so they can gauge, you know, where they are in the big scheme of things, and in the context of this break point. From a tribunal perspective, when considering fairness, then they will consider your actions in the context of how a reasonable employer have acted when making a reasonable decision in the same selection. So again, it comes back to this reasonableness. So redeployment is also massive to your whole process. It's really important, and it's about exploring ways in which that redundancy can be avoided, and redeployment to another role is one way. So with redeployment, you'll either have suitable alternative redeployment or non-suitable alternative roles. And it can get a little bit complex and getting your head around it, but determining if a role is considered suitable or non-suitable is actually fundamental to your process, because it can go on to establish certain rights and protections a person would have when taking up a role. So for a role to be suitable, it's a role that is similar to their redundant role. And by that, I mean consider the salary, the seniority, skills, hours of work, location, responsibilities. And if there is one available, then it must be offered instead of making the employee redundant. If they then unreasonably refuse, they lose their entitlement to statutory redundancy pay. Another important consideration and thing to note is that employees who are at risk of redundancy and who are either pregnant, absent on adoption leave, maternity leave, neonatal, which is coming on the 6th of April, or shared parental leave, they will be given priority for roles over other employees. And then regardless of a role being suitable or not, everybody has a statutory right to a 4-week trial period. So I mentioned a few slides ago, there's a couple of procedures that you don't have to carry out. It's whether it's suitable and works for your business. One of them is being voluntary redundancy, and that's essentially, it's a way of reducing the workforce by making voluntary redundancies in exchange for a redundancy package. So as I said, it doesn't have to be used. There are negatives as well as benefits to using it. It can actually help with improving morale, because if it's inevitable that there needs to be a big business change, asking for volunteers may actually help those who perhaps were wanting to look for a change anyway. It might help with their personal circumstances. And when somebody is choosing to accept something, it's more of that they know the full terms and the implications of doing so. It can also reduce the risk of legal challenge, because the employees are putting themselves forward to be dismissed on the grounds of redundancy. And it allows you as employee to have that greater control over exits from the business, so to better fit in with business needs. And therefore, from that, it can make the transition faster and smoother. But then obviously there are negatives. So you risk losing key talent. You can't really predict the uptake, and therefore how do you manage it if you get too many requests? There will usually be increased costs because you're generally offering a package to entice. And of course, you can lose that key talent and lose that business knowledge that you have. And whilst it is an activity that's not a requirement, you don't have to use it. It's unclear if you're setting a precedent by having used it before, but you could probably, you know, with circumstances in your redundancy process, it might be that you need to own it, but you haven't using it, but you haven't used it before, and vice versa. So it is something that is discretional for an employer to use. And the second approach that could be taken, but it isn't a requirement, and that's known as a process of bumping, which is a funny phrase, and it's quite an odd one really to me. This is where an employee who is at risk of redundancy is moved to a different position that's already occupied, but that second person is the one that is made redundant. It is a legally recognised practice, although it does seem very harsh and strange, moving somebody out of their job, making them redundant. But if you do operate, your obligations are to ensure that the whole process and how you manage that is fair, non-discriminatory. And this leads us on now to a couple of polls really about these two practices. The first one being voluntary redundancy. Would you offer voluntary redundancy first of all?
Okay, I will close and share those results. There we go.
Okay.
So majority
I
would.
something that's probably more used in larger organisations, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because of the risks, the negative. Yeah.
I think so. Okay, so she said there was one more here.
And then we've got, if you
Why
are
would you offer
using,
it?
if you do use or offer voluntary redundancy, what's your rationale for doing that?
Hmm.
Do you see if it's a common thing, Sue, from your operational perspective?
Not as common as you would think. No, very often the employer will use more selection processes so that they can retain the people they need, the skills they need in the business. Because the risk with voluntary is always that the people you want to keep are the ones that volunteer to go. And because they know they'll be fairly easily get another job perhaps. So it's
interesting one.
I mean, you retain the right to say no, of course, but yeah, it is a difficult one. I'll share those results because
to reduce the risk of legal challenge. Interesting. Definitely, I think the impact on morale.
Yeah,
It's
which is
almost like
true.
you're taking a softer approach to redundancy, aren't you? It's
Yes.
far easier if somebody is saying they want it than being told you
That
you are.
Compulsory. Yeah, absolutely. It is a better message saying if you retain the right to say no, that's also important in case you get all the critical skills you need to retain are disappearing. But if you're needing to make significant numbers redundant, it's a good way of achieving that without having that massive negative impact on the rest of the company at the stage.
I would imagine it's a much smoother and faster transition, isn't it? Which is what some of you have voted for. And then just a couple of, I think just a few more polls. If you don't offer voluntary or looking to offer it, what are your reasons for not doing so?
Okay. Oh, just a little flurry coming in. Hang on. Okay, we will close and share those results. So there we go.
Yeah, loss of business knowledge and talent. Yeah, the biggie, isn't it?
It is. And I think that's the real difficult one. Although it's a good message to say to somebody, well, we absolutely can't let you go voluntarily because we absolutely can't do without you. So
yeah. And then just a couple more quick ones. Before today, were you aware of the practice known as, which one's next?
Bumping.
Bumping.
Bumping. Yeah.
Have I got this in twice? I'm not sure I've got this in twice now. It actually isn't that common, is it?
No, we hardly ever. It's probably, I don't know, once every couple of years or so we get asked about it. And often it's because the employer hasn't really considered it and they get asked by the employee, so it completely throws them.
Yeah.
Which is when they're usually contacting us to understand, what can they do.
And that's a really good example of what reasonable could look at. So if you've got the employee bringing it to the table, I would say as a reasonable employer, you would at least explore it.
Yeah.
Still come back and say no, but you've acted reasonably in actually answering their question. And so that's probably a good way of illustrating you have your legal process, but the reasonableness comes into how you apply the legal process.
Yeah.
Now, I think, is that the last poll in this section?
So,
I'm not sure if I've duplicated it.
So the results of that is majority
Oh yeah.
weren't aware. So let me hide that. And
So yeah,
well, it
70%.
was saying, have you ever operated the practice of
Oh yeah.
something? Yeah. So that's the last one. There you go. Which is an interesting one. Yeah, I think it's not surprising. It's I think it's a resounding. Not many have.
Interesting 4% though.
Yeah,
That have done it. I wonder
especially
what
who have
that
tried it. Yeah,
was like for them.
absolutely. So yeah, interesting. It is an interesting concept, and but if you've done the process right, you've been thorough in everything,
Yeah.
then it's usually something that can be handled. But you do need to consider it carefully.
Yeah.
Okay, I think
Interesting.
that's
Yeah,
it.
thank you for those, and thank you everybody. So we're coming towards the latter part of the webinar, and this piece now is about the actual dismissal itself. And obviously you still need to have that fair process for how you handle the dismissal meeting. The one thing that I'll stress is that it is a formal meeting in which redundancy is confirmed. It can only occur once consultation is concluded. That is really, really important. It cannot be confirmed whilst the consultation window is open. Otherwise, it undermines the whole process, because you haven't followed essentially that full consultation and process and explored all alternatives in the time that you have, and therefore likely it can contribute to making that dismissal unfair. In setting up the meeting, remember you have to forewarn the individual in their formal letter of invite that there is the possibility that the role will be confirmed as redundant as an outcome from that consultation process that's just closed, and they must be given the right to be accompanied by a companion. When you conclude that meeting, where you have essentially confirmed the outcome of the consultation process, what your decision is, if you are going on to dismiss them for redundancy, then if you have an appeal stage in your policy, then you must follow it, because you have to comply with your own policy and procedures. But if you either haven't made redundancies before in your organisation, or you don't actually have a policy written down, therefore, then actually there is no legal statutory entitlement to be given the right of appeal when your dismissal is on the grounds of redundancy. So there's technically no lawful right to be giving an employee the right of appeal. So there are pros and cons for that. One of the biggest challenges of offering an appeal, first of all, is what happens if you find the outcome was wrong? What do you do? Particularly if you've got your new structure in motion and people in their roles. How on earth do you manage that practical challenge? But then benefits wise, an appeal process actually gives organisations that further internal mechanism for dealing with errors, procedural flaws, challenges, and so it could probably be a way of resolving some challenges in an alternative way and preventing tribunal claims. So you should be careful when you when you're not giving appeals. You need to take care, because if you've got a practice of offering them, then you really need to think about, has that set a custom and practice, and therefore your redundancy process has already been formed, albeit not in writing, and therefore you should follow it up with offering that appeals process. But I just thought it was interesting to flag that, especially if you've not carried out redundancies before and you haven't got a written down policy, or not got a custom of offering appeals, actually you don't need, there's no legal entitlement. And then finally, statutory redundancy pay. Employees with 2 years continuous service are legally entitled to receive statutory redundancy pay. Now, there is a ready reckoner that the government have in place that uses length of service and age to basically determine how many weeks pay somebody's entitled to. So the statutory weekly rate always goes up in April, and on the 6th of April this year it went up to 719. It was previously £700. So if you are currently in the process of making some redundancies, just make sure you're using the correct figure for your calculations based on the termination date. And essentially, the redundancy pay is based on length of service and age, like I said a moment ago. So half a week's pay for each year the employee was under the age of 22 in your employment, 1 week's pay for each year they were aged between 22 and 40 in your employment, and 1.5 weeks pay for each year they were aged 41 or more in your employment. But as I said, there is a ready reckoner all there on the government website, I believe, that you can use to help you with that. And then don't forget, if you're paying in lieu of notice, i.e. so you don't need them to work their notice period, once you've confirmed the decision that they're redundant, then your contract of employment must allow you for being able to pay in lieu of notice. If it doesn't, essentially and technically that's a breach of contract, because you can't force somebody to be away from the workplace. So just check your contract of employment. If it allows for payment in lieu of notice, then that's an option to you. Actually, it might be that you want the person to remain in employment during their notice period to be part of that handover and transition to the new working world. And then in terms of the statutory redundancy pay, then as I said, they need the 2 years continuous service. So I mentioned a while back that there are implications from the Employment Rights Bill on how organisations manage redundancy. We don't know precisely because it's still going through the consultation, going through the parliamentary process to be made into a piece of law. We expect it will become the Employment Rights Act and get passed in July, around July, and it will significantly impact how you manage collective redundancies. So the original employment bill that came out last October proposed to remove the Act 1 establishment test for the purpose of when collective consultation is triggered, meaning that all redundancies across a business under that initial bill proposed to meaning that all redundancies across your business would count towards a threshold for when starting to collectively consult, and therefore it would potentially lead to more and more redundancies or collective consultation, But as the bill has gone through the House of Commons, it's had many amendments, and it's actually reinstated the one establishment principle. But it allows for regulations to now be developed that sets out a threshold for when collective consultation is triggered for redundancies proposed at more than one establishment. And the threshold is likely to be based either as a percentage of the workforce or on a set number of redundancies. So the threshold is set at the lower of either X number of redundancies or X% of the workforce. So that is something that we can expect to see. As I said, it's not confirmed. We expect it all to become an act of law in around the July. And then just finally, in terms of the implications of the bill, the day one rights may affect an employee dismissed unfairly for redundancy or following a restructure or reorganisation affecting the business, as they would potentially be able to bring a claim from their dismissal from day one of employment, even while in their contractual or statutory probation period. So there's a lot going on generally with legislation changes. Redundancy is very much part of the bill. We continue to follow it, so do sign up to our newsletters to stay informed if you're a member of our knowledge base, and obviously we post updates. So I'm conscious that it's 11 o'clock. This last final slide, we've got a couple more polls, but essentially I just wanted to talk through business transition. And as I said, it's probably one of the most challenging business activities because of the implications. And so planning how you're going to manage communications is going to be important. You know, how you communicate the vision, starting from when you first make the announcement and place people at risk of redundancy all the way through the process and in the weeks and months post any redundancies. So it's about thinking how you can share clear and positive vision for the future of the business post restructuring explaining the rationale behind the changes and how the redundancy contributes to the long-term strategy, and address any remaining uncertainty and providing reassurance. It's also important to think about how you're going to support remaining employees post redundancies. So acknowledge the impact of the redundancy process on those who remain. It could, for example, have a potential for increased workload, anxiety, survivor guilt, for example. If workload does change, then think about strategies for managing that increased workload and providing necessary resources and support mechanisms. There'll also be a need for redefining roles and responsibilities. Clearly communicating any changes in job roles is going to be challenging. It's about ensuring that you've got those clear job descriptions, person specifications, reporting structures, and any necessary training that you need. And then for ensuring as little disruption to your teams and relationships as possible, focus on how you can rebuild team dynamics and morale. So facilitate, for example, some team building activities to foster that renewed collaboration and cohesion within the teams. Create opportunities, for example, for open communication and address any lingering negativity or resentment, which can naturally occur following restructuring. From a business perspective, there'll be an important need for reviewing adapting processes, so assessing the efficiency and effectiveness of existing processes in your new structure, identify areas for improvement, and implement any necessary adjustments. And actually monitor and evaluate the impact of redundancy, so look at your key metrics to track the success of the redundancy programme and the transition. So can you look at your productivity data, your employee engagement statistics, turnover, and then regularly reviewing these metrics and making further adjustments as needed. And then we also have the importance of learning from experience, conducting a post-redundancy review, look at lessons learned, areas for improvement, how can you refine your process should you need to manage redundancies again in the future, and focus on future growth and stability by shifting the focus towards future opportunities, strategic goals, reiterating the long-term benefits of the restructuring, and celebrating successes and milestones is also important as you go through the transition period. So before we move on to some other slides and take your questions, just a quick poll. If you would like to find out more about our services, then do let us know.
Yeah, I think it's this is also to help us. Yeah, this is also to help us understand what resources we need to develop and where to target them. So we use all the sort of information we glean from these polls to help us develop the future. It could be future webinars, or it could be future resource, or and how we can support you better. So that's the reason for asking this question at this point.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll close that poll now.
Thank you.
Okay. There you go, back to you.
Okay, and as you'll see on this slide here, if you do want support with managing redundancy, then there's a QR code. Please do get in touch and speak to our team. You know, we're more than happy to help. We can help guide you through the redundancy process. As I said, we can get involved as early on to help with the planning, preparing for it, and just helping you to manage that smooth transition. So do click that QR code if that can be of help for you. So I know it's 11:06 and it's the first time in a while I have overrun. But do we have any questions?
Yes, lots. So what I'll do is I'll just condense them to 2 or 3 shorter ones, and I think we'll respond with a Q&A on some of them as well. I also think some of the questions that have been asked will have been covered by subsequent slides that were asked early on in the process, but there are, you know, 1 or 2 that are, I think, useful to just pull out a little bit more information. So the first one is about It's the timing of once you've made people redundant, and the redundancy quite genuine because the work is diminished, and you no longer need the team of people that you had employed to do that particular kind of work. It's the question is, do we need to wait a certain period after the employees are terminated before we can engage contractors to do that? Because it's very sporadic now, and they don't need a full-time team base to do it. And I think it's also being really careful if the contractors you're engaging are to do exactly the same work for the people that you just made redundant. Be careful you're not engaging the same number of people for the same length of time, i.e. full-time or equivalent hours, that there is a difference, that it is only a short project maybe, and it's ad hoc, so you only need to engage a small piece, do it on a small scale, then you'll probably be okay. I think you also need to be careful if you're engaging the people you've just made redundant, then you do need to leave a gap between engaging them as a contractor. So it's officially a week, isn't it? But we normally recommend longer than that to avoid any claim that they shouldn't have been made redundant or it should have been extended for that piece of work. So
it's a good question, because it's not just, I guess, from a legal point of view, but actually the rest of the workforce that remain. And it's about thinking about your existing workforce, and if they've just gone through a period of change and then they're seeing contractors coming in doing what they believe to be the same work that their friends were made redundant for, it's thinking about the impact on employee engagement, morale. So there's lots of non-legal things to be thinking about, as well as the legal implications as well. So there's no set time frame. Obviously the longer the better, because you're giving that break, that very clear break, but it can probably raise more questions than what you'd hope if you do start bringing in lots of contractors.
Absolutely. And what you want to be careful of is, you might want to leave it for 6 months, say, to allow the tribunal period to go through.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Sue, because it is changing. So under the Employment Rights Bill, and this could be from October this year, the time limits will extend from 3 months to 6 months, meaning employers have that longer period to be waiting for a tribunal claim. So just bear that in mind as well. We have recently run our online seminar, Employment Law Update, so do check that out if you want any more information.
Yeah, absolutely. So another one is it possible to make redundancies with the potential worker being made redundant currently signed off with arthritis in the wrist? So, well, yes, you can include people in the selection pool that are absent, as in it could be maternity reasons, it could be long-term sick, it could be other things, but so yes, you must include them in the consultation and try and adapt the consultation to their needs. But there's an issue around, is there a capability issue here, and does it need to be dealt with separately? So I think it's potentially, you need to be careful that you're using the right process, I think, and taking into account if it's affecting their ability to work. Arthritis in the wrist, is that a separate thing you need to deal with? Whatever affords the individual the most protection, really, you need to be really careful. So, but yes, you should include people that who are in the pool and try and adapt the process to be able to include them. And obviously, so they may have additional rights because they're in a particular situation, such as they may be pregnant. So obviously there are additional rights and priorities that you must afford to them. I think that's probably a broad outline of be careful. And then linked to that is what happens if there is a pregnant employee in an individual or collective redundancy. Again, it's treat them the same, make adaptations to enable them to participate and take into account their additional rights, I think is really what you have to do. and they will have priority over any vacancies and things like that as part of the process. So, if an alternative could be a demotion and less hours, would that be acceptable if the employee was receptive? Absolutely. But you probably want to use your trial period in that particularly, because that may or may not work. They might find it difficult, because and there is a risk that they will just keep looking for another role and that you lose them anyway. So, but it is something that you could seriously discuss with the individual. Yeah,
and that'd be an example of an alternative role as opposed to a suitable alternative.
Absolutely. And then finally, for now, I think because of the time, but this is another good question: is a selection criteria required when a whole department is up for redundancy? Yeah, exactly.
Well, this is an interesting one, because are there other people in the organisation? I mean, I've got no clues to the organisation structure set up, clearly, but when you identify who's in the pool, you need to think more broadly, not just the immediate team, because if you've got people with similar skills or does similar activities, they need to be brought into the pool.
Yeah. So, and it'll all build around your business case, won't it, for the decision as to who is in the pool, why you've selected that department, why, in the context of that entire business. So, so potentially not, but there's an awful lot around that would need to be explored. It really depends. And then it is difficult for us to give specific advice without knowing the entire context, because as you're aware, redundancy is a complex thing, and there are many, many factors at work with it. And also we have this reasonableness, non-legal definition of reasonable, which always makes it an interesting challenge. So it would be one that would be worth seriously considering, and would be we'd need to look at that as a whole.
I think the first thing I would say to you is to look at other roles in that organisation of yours to see if there should be other people brought into the pool or brought into the process, to then work out what numbers you need to reduce by, etc., and therefore what sort of pool you need.
But yeah, so I think that's probably enough in the time now, and and we will get back to any of the others via a Q&A afterwards. It might take us a few days, but we'll get back to you with some more information on some of the other questions.
Yeah, thank you, Sue.
Thank you.
And I guess do keep in touch with us, because we're obviously monitoring the employment rights bill, so we'll post all the updates around how that progresses, especially when it comes to the redundancy reforms, and you can keep in touch with us. There's a QR code there, you can send an email, there's a phone line there as well, and you can find us all on social media. So do follow us just to keep up to date and sign up to our newsletter. And also, if you're a knowledge base user, then you can keep up to date with all the newsletter items and new articles that get posted. Talking of our knowledge base, this is basically an online HR resource, and it's a way of providing you with access to a wealth of information and documentation. So there's over 600-700 articles, and the articles cover the employee life cycle. So we have a huge amount of articles all on redundancy and managing that. And then we've also got lots of templates, so policies, checklists for if you're doing a consultation, letters for if you're putting people at risk, etc., etc. So if you are interested in that, there's a QR code again there, and you can find out more on our website of our HR knowledge base. And then if you're new to our webinars, we run these monthly. So we've targeted our programme from this year based on what we believe is going to be significant from the Employment Rights Bill. So next month is all about statutory sick pay changes, because this is going to be massive. So I'm going to be talking you through that. That's the bill, the webinar for May. Then we're going to move on to looking at family friendly leave and flexible working. So that will be the June webinar. And then we'll look at probation period, because as you may know, there's going to be a new statutory probation period introduced, not until later next year, but we need to start having the conversation thinking about the implications for new employees and probation period. So we're covering that. And then after that, we're returning to some more business as usual content, and we're looking at the 4 primary areas of discrimination. And we will also then look at how you can protect the business from tribunals, especially with the tribunal extensions coming in that I mentioned. So that is likely, I can't confirm it because it's still going through, but from what we're reading, we expect that to be October, where people can put a tribunal claim in up to 6 months after leaving employment or after the event. And then the last couple of webinars, one will be around the budget implications on human resource management, and the new deal for working people around planning for change. So how we look at moving into 2026. So do register. All our webinars are free, and you'll find our schedule on either the knowledge base or the main website. And then we're also offering a free 30-minute consultation with one of our experienced HR advisors. So it could be you have a potential redundancy situation you're not sure how to prepare for, or you might have some performance challenges that you need to manage, or what have you. Please do get in touch, and we'll be more than happy to give you our thoughts in that 30-minute consultation. And that just leaves me to say thank you to everybody for joining us today for the webinar. We hope you come to all our future ones. Thank you to Sue for supporting in the polls and the questions. And I hope everybody has a good end to the week. So hopefully see you next time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.